epigenetics and morphic resonance are both about inheritance. And they're about inheritance of individuals and also of groups and of fields of groups. So I'm going to start by giving a historical overview, because the whole subject of inheritance has been very controversial over the last 50 to 70 years. And it's been very confusing to know what's going on. And if you see it in its historical context, it's easier. Well, traditionally, people always knew that parents their children tended to resemble their parents. And this was well known for plant and animal breeding as well. Long before Mendel, long before Darwin, long before university departments of genetics, people were breeding plants and animals. And in fact, in Darwin's book, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, which is one of his favorite books of mine, he talks about the way in which people have bred cabbages and dogs and pigeons and so on for generations, selective breeding, to create the different races of dogs and cabbage and so on. You know, kale and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and Savoy cabbages and red cabbages and so on. They're all the same species. And the fact they're so different is because they've been selectively bred. And dogs are all the same species, even though a Pekingese and an Afghan hound look so very different. They're actually part of the same species, and they're a tremendous tribute to the power of selective breeding. And that, of course, was the main argument behind Darwin's idea of natural selection, comparing it with artificial selection, human selection. All of this had been going on for long, long before science appeared on the scene, and long before genetics. At the beginning of the 19th century, a French pioneering evolutionary theorist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, put forward an idea of evolution, one of the first people to propose that species grew, developed, and changed over time. And he thought it all depended on habit. If a giraffe reaches up to eat leaves off high branches, it stretches up, its neck stretches and gets longer, and then if that's passed on to the children, they're born with longer necks, and so on. It's called Lamarckian inheritance. Darwin was a firm believer in it. So he didn't actually add much to Lamarck's ideas about inheritance, except for the idea of natural selection, how nature can actually select among all the many variations there are. So that was Darwin's addition to Lamarck, and Darwin took it for granted that animals and plants inherited adaptations from their parents. He even wrote a letter to Nature, the International Scientific Journal, about a case of a dog someone he knew had a dog that just went crazy whenever it was near a butcher's shop. It was just terrified of butcher's shops. And it turned out his father had been terrified of butcher's shops. And Darwin didn't know why, but he assumed that the grandfather had been attacked by a butcher. But he saw this as an inherited pattern that depended on something in the past, even though he couldn't identify what it was. Well, by the beginning of the 20th century, within biology, a new approach to inheritance came about through genetics. There were some initial experiments by Gregor Mendel, who did his experiments in I think, Slovakia. And Mendel showed that there were genes. And by the beginning of the 20th century, genetics began to take off. And people then thought that genes would explain all of inheritance. And it became a tremendous bandwagon, genetics. And when the structure of DNA, the genetic material, was found in 1953, people thought that at last the molecular secret of inheritance was about to be laid bare. And so there was a huge emphasis on genetics. And the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, which became orthodox in biology in the 1940s, really put together Darwin's ideas on natural selection with a genetic theory of inheritance. All inheritance depends on chemical genes, and natural selection is about selecting the frequency of genes in populations. And this became the basis of the whole selfish gene theory, so ably popularized by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene, 1974. So the idea that genes they're totally responsible for all inheritance, and it's all molecular, and it's all chemical, and none of it can be influenced by what happens to the parents, because genes can only change through random mutation, and all that evolution could do is select gene frequencies in populations. So as part of the neo-Darwinian package, there was a kind of ban on the inheritance of acquired characters, or Lamarckian inheritance. It was in fact treated as heretical in biology, and every effort was made to stamp it out. Some people who did research on it, like the Austrian biologist Paul Kammerer, got very good evidence for it, but he was accused of fraud, his experiments were said to be fake, and he was actually driven to suicide. So this was not just sort of gentle, polite arguments. So these were tremendously bitter arguments within biology, and enormously emotional and impassioned. And the people who wanted everything to be explained by genes were, generally speaking, materialists, and many of them militant atheists, who thought that you could get rid of all the mystery from life by explaining its inner secret, the secret of inheritance, in purely chemical and physical terms. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a completely different history unfolded in the 20th century, where the idea of inheritance of acquired characters, or Lamarckian inheritance, was the orthodoxy in the Soviet Union under the leadership of a biologist called Lysenko. Stalin liked Lysenko's ideas because, on the whole, communists and socialist theories always liked the ideas that you could modify human nature by changing the environment. So if you could bring up people in a better way, improve the environment, they'd become better people and they'd have better children. Whereas right-wing people have always gone for the genetic theory, because that says people are just born unequal. There's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You can give people equal opportunities, but they'll always be unequal. And basically, it's just a matter of luck or chance who gets which genes. There's no point trying to do social engineering to do anything about it. So there's always been this political background. In the Soviet Union, Mendelian geneticists were persecuted. Some were sent to Siberia, some were executed. So this was an incredibly bitter period in the history of biology over this question of inheritance. And Lysenko and his colleagues claimed to have good examples of the inheritance of acquired characters, but they were just dismissed in the West as fraudulent. I came onto the scene in my own biological research, where I was working in Cambridge from the 1960s onwards, late 60s, on plant development. And I was trying to understand how the forms of plants are inherited. I came to the conclusion that they weren't inherited through the genes, but they were inherited as habits through a process I called morphic resonance. Morphic resonance is the influence of the past or past generations on the present through a kind of collective memory within each species. I'll come back to it in a moment, but I'm just giving the historical overview at the moment. So my first book, A New Science of Life, was published in 1981, and it was immensely controversial because I was arguing that you could actually inherit things that the parents had learned or acquired, or adaptations they'd acquired, which was similar to what Lamarck had said and to what Darwin had said, but was, and similar indeed to what Lysenko was saying in the Soviet Union, but was the ultimate taboo in Western biology. So this book was extremely controversial. Famously, the editor of Nature wrote an editorial entitled A Book for Burning, and it was on the front page of Nature, and it compared it unfavorably to Mein Kampf by Hitler. So it was really a kind of passionate denunciation. And as I say, this topic incredibly emotional. It's hard to realize now just how extremely emotional supposedly rational scientific debate can become. Anyway, I was interested in getting evidence for this, and I found there's already a lot of evidence for morphic resonance, the inheritance of what parents had acquired. For example, a long series of experiments with rats that were started in the 1920s showed that rats that had been trained to escape from a water maze by swimming to the right exit, they got better at it generation by generation. The first generation, on average, they made about 250 errors before they learned and got it right every time. By the 30th generation, they were only making about 25 errors on average. So it had been a tenfold increase in the rate of learning. And this was originally done to try and prove Lamarckian inheritance, the inheritance of acquired characters. But it was therefore immensely controversial. And so the people who were against it tried repeating it at Edinburgh University and at Melbourne University in Australia. Their rats started off with about 25 errors, that more or less where the Harvard rats had left off. The initial experiments were done at Harvard. And whereas at Harvard, the McDougall, who did these experiments, thought that he was proving the inheritance of acquired characters, the Australian researchers included a control line of rats, none of whose parents had ever been trained. And they found that, sure enough, just as McDougall had found, rats descended from trained parents got better at it over the generations, but so did the control rats, the ones whose parents had never been exposed to it. So this showed it wasn't something that was modifying the genes, because it wasn't just passed down from parent to children. They were all getting better at it. Now, it's exactly what I would predict on the basis of morphic resonance. But not what would be predicted either by Darwinism or neo-Darwinism or by Lamarckian inheritance, because it should just go through the parental line. So anyway, this morphic resonance, quite a number of tests have been done over the years. It should be getting easier to learn things that other people have learned, for example. One current test that's going on, inspired by Jill actually, who's a great devotee of the five-letter word puzzle, Wordle. So some may have heard of or come across Wordle. Well, you see, this should be a perfect test for morphic resonance. There's a new word every day, a new puzzle. There are no clues, it's just 5 blanks. And so, according to morphic resonance, it should get easier for people to do Wordle as the day goes on, because so many people have already solved it, so picking up on their memory. And there's a student doing an MSc on morphic resonance and Wordle right now, and she's found indeed that seems to be happening. She was doing it. She didn't get up very early, so she'd only do it between 9 p.m. and about 6 p.m. It's 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. So she didn't get a very wide spread. And her supervisor and I both think we need a bigger spread. She's now getting up so she can do the first test before 6 a.m. and the last one at 11 p.m. And so we're looking forward to seeing the results of this bigger time span. For similar reasons, many people have found that if they do the Times crossword puzzle, that it's easier to do the day after it's published than the morning when it's published, because so many people have already solved it. And Jill and my son Merlin, who's a biologist, when he was 16 and he was doing his national exams here in Britain, GCSE, the General Certificate of Secondary Education, it's done all over the country at the same time. They have to synchronize the exams because otherwise people could ring up their friends and tell them the questions. When Merlin was 16 and he was doing GCSE, he came to me one day and said, "Daddy, my friends and I have worked out a way of getting extra marks in GCSE without doing extra work." So I said, "Well, how are you going to do that?" And he said, "By morphic resonance." "How will that work?" He said, "Well, in the physics paper For example, there are 12 questions, and we're going to do questions 11 and 12 first, and then go back to 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll be about 10 minutes behind everyone else in Britain for the first 10 questions. So we should get a boost by morphic resonance. And I said, well, some of your friends must have been morphic resonance skeptics. What did they say? He said, well, they said they were morphic resonance skeptics and it wouldn't work. But he said we worked out the worst that would happen if morphic resonance didn't happen was it wouldn't work, and we'd still have to answer all the questions. But if we did it this way, we'd get this extra boost if there was morphic resonance. Anyway, they all got A stars. So there's a practical way in which morphic resonance can be tested and can help people. Now, morphic resonance doesn't just apply to biology, it also applies to the rest of nature. If you make a new chemical compound for the first time that's never been made before, and you crystallize it, there won't be a morphic field, the morphic pattern for its crystals, because they haven't existed before. So you may have to wait quite a while until they come into existence, something quite new happening for the first time. In fact, chemists often wait months, if not years, to get the first crystals of something. It often takes a very long time. But once it's been crystallized in one place, it gets easier all around the world. This is very well known to chemists. It's absolutely standard in chemistry. And chemists don't dispute this fact. In fact, they tell anecdotes about it. But they assume that this must be explained by chemists getting better at doing it, or by fragments of previous crystals being wafted around as dust particles in the air and settling out in labs all over the world. Whereas morphic resonance would predict that the same thing should happen even if you filter out dust particles. So there's already quite a lot of evidence from chemistry. Another line of evidence is that as crystals become better established, as they happen more and more often, they become more habitual. The habits become stronger, the field of the crystal would get stronger. It'd be harder to break it up. And the way you break up crystals is by heating them until you get to their melting point. So this theory predicts that the melting points of crystals should go up over time. Well, of course, they're not supposed to, according to regular science, because they're called physical constants. And physical constants are, by definition, supposed to be constant. When I actually looked at the archives of melting point research by getting out dust-covered volumes from the Patent Office Library, which went back for years with melting points, I found that with hundreds of examples, yes, they do go up over time, some of them quite a lot, 10, 20, 30 degrees centigrade. And moreover, the ones that go up are compounds that have been relatively newly made in the last 100, 150 years. Whereas compounds that crystallize in nature, like salicin in willow bark, for example, it's a natural compound used as a herbal substance. Compounds that crystallize in nature and have been doing so for millions of years show no change. The habits, I think, are so well established they don't change. With morphic resonance, as a habit builds up, you see things get quicker or easier, but it reaches a limit. You know, it reaches an upper limit where it's then asymptotically approaches a limit, so you get very little change once things have become very well established habits. So this idea suggests that in every species there's a collective memory, individuals draw upon it and contribute to it, and morphic resonance affects behavior, instincts, learning, the ability to learn, and shape. It's not what determines the proteins. What the genes do is determine the sequence of amino acids in proteins. You have to have the right proteins, and if you have a deficient gene and a deficient protein, then you get a deficient body in some way. It's just like if you're making a building and you have deficient bricks that crumble, the building you make won't look normal. It will be less strong than usual, and probably bits will crumble off it. That doesn't prove that the bricks determine the architectural plan of the building. And I think the morphic fields, which are the fields through which this form is expressed, are what shape the forms of faces and hands and arms and legs and flowers and leaves and roots and all these organs and organisms. So I think they're shaped by morphic resonance through these fields. The genes, they're necessary for producing the right proteins. Well, now continuing the historical overview, when we come to the year about 2000, the evidence for the inheritance of acquired characteristics became unavoidable. It was piling up so much that people couldn't deny it any longer. So what happened was that it was rebranded epigenetic inheritance, and then people said, well, there must be a molecular explanation for it. It must be changes in the switching on or switching off the genes, or other changes, chemical changes, that would explain epigenetic inheritance. So when people said it must have a molecular explanation, people thought, okay, that's all right then. So they gave up this long entrenched resistance to the inheritance of acquired characters. And epigenetic inheritance has now become a very hot area in biology and biological research. Quite a lot of people are doing it. And it's now that it's allowed to be done, and now that people can actually discuss it, there's examples popping up all over the place. One experiment Jill might have mentioned with mice is where they trained mice to be afraid of a particular smell, the smell of acetophenone, a synthetic chemical. Male mice were trained they were sniffed acetophenone and they were given an electric shock, and very soon, by kind of Pavlovian conditioned reflex, whenever they smelt acetophenone, they were petrified. And when mice are petrified, they're literally petrified, they freeze. You can see when they're afraid, you easily measure the freeze reaction. The scientists then bred from these male mice with female mice that had never been exposed to acetophenone, and their children were terrified of acetophenone, and their grandchildren, even though the mothers had had no exposure to it. And they found this effect even happened with artificial insemination, so it wasn't some kind of the male mouse whispering into females' ear, watch out for acetophenone. The paper in Nature describing this research was called Inheriting the Fears of Fathers. So this is a major shift from 20th century biology. Older people here will remember how that atmosphere was such a strong taboo. Now there are many experiments on epigenetic inheritance. For example, it's been found that if you expose tomato plants to caterpillars and they eat the caterpillar leaves, that when you take seeds from those tomato plants and grow plants from them, those plants are more resistant to caterpillars. They've inherited caterpillar resistance compared with plants that weren't attacked by caterpillars. It's not a change in the genes, it's an epigenetic effect. So epigenetic inheritance is inheritance that's not mediated by genes. And I think that this epigenetic effect with tomatoes could actually be applied. No one's done it yet, but if there are any entrepreneurs here, there's an opening here for a successful new business, epigenetic seeds. Because right now, you see, seed companies are dominated by geneticists and people who do genetic modification and so forth. And they see a seed, when you buy a commercially produced seed for wheat or maize or other crops, they see these seeds as just a package containing DNA. The way in which it's grown is completely irrelevant for them. You know, if it's grown on a chemical farm in huge fields with automated equipment sprayed with glyphosate and all that, doesn't bother them, because they just think it's a package containing DNA. But if the way it's been grown actually affects what happens in the next generation, then it could actually be an advantage to buy seeds that have been heavily attacked by caterpillars from plants that have been attacked by caterpillars. Which is why, if I were an entrepreneur, I'd go around organic farmers who don't spray their crops, find out ones who'd had particularly bad insect attacks, and say, buy the seeds they do get at a premium price, and then sell them as epigenetic seeds that would be more insect resistant. So you wouldn't even need to grow special crops and infect them with insects. You could just go to organic farmers or people with allotments who don't spray their crops, who have a bad insect attack. And the way in which the seed is produced would actually matter. A lot of organic growers actually believe this already, which is why they get organic seeds from other organic growers. So there's now been research of all kinds on epigenetics, including with a small nematode worm called Caenorhabditis elegans, which is the main model organism used in molecular biology today for animal research. And people have shown that if you train these worms to move towards food that's been flavored with a synthetic chemical, in this case benzaldehyde, the next generation will automatically move towards benzaldehyde. They'll be attracted to it. It dies out after 2 or 3 generations. But if you do it repeatedly for 5 generations or more, it doesn't die out. And even after 50 generations, they're attracted to benzaldehyde. So there's been this whole change with enormous significance for evolutionary theory. Because what this epigenetic inheritance means is that evolution can happen much quicker than by just random mutation. You may have to wait hundreds of generations for a mutant gene to come along, and then natural selection to increase its frequency in the population, many more generations. Whereas if adaptive responses of plants or animals or microbes can be inherited straight away by the next generation, if it's of advantage, you've got much more rapid evolution, much more creative evolution, because creative adaptations, holistic responses, are immediately passed on to the next generation. And so this has led to a whole new evolutionary theory called the extended evolutionary synthesis, which has superseded neo-Darwinism, which had a shrill emphasis on genes and genes alone, with a few extra footnotes. But basically the extended evolutionary synthesis says, yes, of course we've got genetic inheritance, but we've got all these other kinds of inheritance as well, epigenetic inheritance. Now, how does epigenetic inheritance really work? Well, the assumption among most researchers is that it must be some molecular mechanism that switches on or off genes, and that organisms inherit from their parents genes that are switched on or off. Now, there's not a lot of evidence for that, but it makes people feel comfortable with the whole idea because it sounds as if it's got a molecular mechanism. But I think a lot of this epigenetic, these results are actually a result of morphic resonance, not epigenetics. And last year I did an experiment, earlier this year, I did an experiment in a lab in Holland to try and compare morphic resonance and epigenetics, because morphic resonance would say that, this was done with nematode worms, that ones that become attracted to a chemical, ones who are descended from those would be attracted to it. Morphic resonance would say that all the worms of that kind would get more attracted to it just because some had learned. It wouldn't just be the descendants. Well, unfortunately, the experiment was inconclusive because we got a chemical that they weren't very attracted to. We had to choose a new chemical, and unfortunately, we didn't test it before the experiment. We hadn't got enough time or money to do it, so we gambled on a particular chemical and picked the wrong one. But nevertheless, the experiment is perfectly possible in principle. And I think that in general, morphic resonance effects would explain a lot of what is now called epigenetic inheritance. Now, morphic resonance has a lot of other implications. It's based on similarity. Similar patterns of activity resonate across time and space with later ones. And the idea is that this memory is transmitted directly across time. It's not a familiar idea. People often say, well, where is it stored? Well, memory, the idea that memory is stored is imposing a spatial metaphor on memory. Storage can only be somewhere in space. Where is it stored? But memory is actually a relationship in time. and not in space. And I think it works radically differently. This is something a number of philosophers have said over the years, including Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, C.S. Peirce, no relation to Jill, the American philosopher, and a number of others, William James, for example. Anyway, I think that memories are transmitted by morphic resonance on the basis of similarity. And when you think about our own memories that we inherit, the patterns, habits, and dispositions, we'll inherit them from the people who are most similar to us in the past, which is going to be usually the members of our family, and then more widely the members of our culture, and then more widely, if we're widely, all human beings at the last resort. But the most specific would be from our own families and ancestors. But then the most specific of all, if you think about it for a moment, is perhaps surprising. When you say, who is the person in the past most similar to me? The answer is me. So the most similar person in the past to every one of us is ourselves. And that means the most specific morphic resonance acting on us from the past will be from ourselves in the past. I think that most of our memories and habits are passed on by morphic resonance from our own past. I don't think they're stored inside the brain. Now, you've all been brought up with the idea that memories are in the head. They're stored inside the brain. And people have spent more than 100 years trying to find memories inside brains, assuming that they're based on modified nerve endings or synapses or phosphorylated proteins or even changes in DNA or RNA. So far, they've completely failed to find these memory traces. And the latest attempt was with mice, where they have microelectrodes, hundreds of microelectrodes in the heads of mice, so they can measure their brain waves with unique specificity, much more than ever before, much higher specificity. And they found when they train these mice to do a maze, when they remember it and go through the maze again, there's a particular pattern of waves in their brain. It's a quite complex pattern of waves to do with this remembering the maze. The interesting thing is that at first they thought, well, here's the pattern. It must be these cells that are storing the memory. Then they found that actually what matters is the pattern itself. And the pattern can move around different parts of the brain. It's not always in the same place. It can shift around. This is now called representational drift. And it's the latest attempt to find fixed memory traces, which has failed. What seems to be happening is the resonant pattern, not the actual cells and chemicals that are sort of frozen into those cells. So, surprisingly, the nature of memory is an open question, and it fits the facts better to think of it as not being inside the brain, as working by morphic resonance, than it all being stored inside the head. You may think, well, surely brain damage gives loss of memory, and indeed it does. Strokes, brain injuries, concussion can all lead to loss of memory, as can progressive diseases like Alzheimer's. Doesn't that prove the memories are in the brain? Well, no. If I came and damaged your TV set, if I damaged the sound circuit, for example, so that you couldn't get any sounds out of the TV set, it wouldn't prove all those sounds arise inside the TV set and nothing but the activity of those transistors and things. Damaging the TV set affects its ability to receive and process information it picks up by resonance from the aerial. And TV and radio and mobile phones all work on resonance across space. This room's full of invisible mobile phone and TV and radio transmissions, and you don't notice them unless you have the right receiver tuned at the right frequency to pick them up. So I think our brains are picking up transmissions across time from ourselves in the past and from lots of other people beforehand, especially our ancestors. And this has implications for the question of survival of bodily death. If your memories are all stored in your brain, then clearly when you die, they'll all be wiped out. which is why materialists are so anti-religious, because they think, it's all in the brain. It just doesn't make sense to say there's any survival of bodily death, because all your consciousness is nothing but the head, the activity inside the head, and all the memories are there. It's all just wiped out. But if the memories are not stored in the brain, then the question of survival of memory becomes a much more open one. And it could be that memories are transmitted even from one generation to another. Some cases of remembering past lives, for example, could be a transfer of memory by morphic resonance. So memory is very much an open question, and interestingly, some of you may have come across recent studies on what's called terminal lucidity, where people who've had Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia for years, in a day or two or even a few hours before they die, suddenly know who everyone is, remember what's going on, know that they're dying, they're completely lucid, and then they die. And that's why it's called terminal lucidity. And something somewhat similar processes happen with animals. I wrote a paper on this recently. Many animals show a surge of energy and clarity and seem to know they're dying just before they die. Now, obviously, these people with Alzheimer's wouldn't be able to remember all these things in terminal lucidity if the memories have been destroyed. The ability to retrieve them had been impaired for sure, but the memories themselves are still there. Now, I want to come on briefly to social groups. Social groups have patterns of organization through morphic fields. A flock of birds, for example, can turn, like starlings, can turn almost simultaneously without bumping into each other. Not only do they know where their neighbors are, but they know where they're going to go. And this is best thought of as a field phenomenon, where they're responding to a group field of the whole flock. The best computer models treat it as a field phenomenon. And I think it is a field phenomenon. I think that termites, when they construct their elaborate nests with complex architecture, are responding to a field, a kind of invisible plan of the nest, which is not in their individual brains. And they don't even know, they can't even see where to put their little bits of mud when they're building it. Each termite carries a little ball of mud and puts it in the right place, but they're blind, so they can't even see what they're doing. They're responding to a collective field. And I think human social groups have fields of that kind too, families being the most obvious example, but also other groups like football teams or all sorts of other platoons in the army. There are all sorts of human social groups. We all belong to lots of different groups, societies, clubs, churches, institutions, schools, colleges, and so forth. Each has its own morphic field, and the members of the group have their place and interrelations through that field. And the patterns within the morphic field are inherited by morphic resonance, and in the case of family constellations, from past generations of the family. Well, this is something you've all been exploring in a very practical way, so I won't talk more about your own discoveries. Well, I wasn't here when you made them. So, but in general, the principle is that there's a memory in the family field. I think that social fields are a very important part in all social groups. And the final point I want to make is about rituals. In all religions and traditional societies, there are rituals. And rituals often involve reenacting a particular foundation story of the group. The group traces identity to a particular foundational event, and the ritual reenacts it. For Jewish people, the Passover is one such ritual. When the Jewish people left Egypt, and the destroying power of God that destroyed the firstborn sons of the Egyptians and of their cattle, destroyed them the Jewish people were passed over, and the Pharaoh just couldn't wait to see the back of them, so they managed to go and escape, and it started the journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land. Well, every year Jewish people reenact that Passover dinner, that dinner on that fateful night that's so important for Jewish identity. And by taking part in it, Jewish people become Jewish, culturally Jewish, by taking part in the ritual. And they're connected to all those who've done it before. And you see, by doing rituals in a similar way every year or every time they're done, there's a morphic resonance that connects the participants with those who've done it over previous generations. So it's a spiritual practice that connects people to each other and to the ancestors. Christian Holy Communion, itself a Passover dinner, the Last Supper of Jesus and his disciples, is reenacted in every communion service or Mass or Eucharist. And indeed, most of us are going to take part in one very soon this evening. The American Thanksgiving dinner is a secular example, a national example of a ritual meal, which enables Americans to identify as American by participating in it and connect with all those who've done it right back to the first settlers and their first Thanksgiving dinner in the New World. So rituals have this quality, and so do festivals. When there's a festival each year, like All Souls Day, or the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, September the 29th, or Christmas, or all cultures have their festivals, all religions. Then again, if they're seasonal festivals, you've got the same time of year, the same rituals, the same kind of celebration, again, the same sense of connection over time. And I think one of the problems with secularism is that insofar as it detaches people from their traditional religious roots, it makes them isolated individuals, and they're separated from rituals which give this sense of connection with others and with continuity with the past. I mean, you can reinvent rituals, and humanists, secular humanists here in Britain, have celebrants. They train celebrants because they've actually recognized that you have to have rites of passage and you have to have rituals. So it's interesting that even the people who are most against them, militant atheists, have formed secular humanist groups with celebrants because they too recognize the importance of these rituals in our lives. So since we're going to do one this evening, I might just mention one aspect.
Before we go into that, I just thought it might be good to talk a bit more about what we're doing and then talk about that. And
well, we are doing that.
Well, I was going to say if you could mention the research done in Israel, about the Swedish famine and the Dutch famine and so on.
Oh, well, that's evidence. That was some of the early evidence for epigenetics in the early part of this century about the inherited effects of famines in Holland and in Sweden, where people who'd been exposed to the famine had children or grandchildren who were developed differently. They were smaller, and they had, I've forgotten if it's more or less proneness to diabetes, but there were physiological and physical effects that were epigenetic. And so some of the first evidence for human epigenetics came from these studies of people who've been subject to famines. And so that was a kind of large-scale epigenetic effects.
Well, anything else you can say about this particular aspect of the work in relation to epigenetics?
Well,
exclusion and trauma and so on.
Well, this is when you get to exclusion and trauma and the effect on family patterns, this isn't something scientists typically study, because the main research on this is actually within the family constellation area. And I myself think that it would be a really important thing to have more studies on these effects of exclusion and trauma through family constellations.
Well, René was saying that the same woman who did the research on in Holland and find in Sweden was also did research on the children, the children who were in the womb at the time of the Twin Towers. I don't know if you know about that.
No, I don't.
And so waiting to see what happens to them, for example, which would be another example.
Well, that wouldn't. So, if it was in the womb, it would be fall into the category of an effect. You have to distinguish between something that happened to a previous generation and something that happens in utero. We know that there are many influences. A lot of women don't take drugs or drink when they're pregnant because they might affect the embryo. We know from the sad case of thalidomide, when women took this sleeping pill, thalidomide, when they were pregnant, their children came out without limbs in many cases, and they were with birth defects. So it's well established that what happens in the womb can affect the child adversely. Whether or not, I don't know how many studies there have been on whether children are happier and better if their mothers meditate more or listen to classical music or what. But that's a whole field of research that's somewhat distinct from epigenetics.
But it would still be a kind of group trauma, societal trauma, which would be inherited somehow or other.
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, certainly a trauma to the mothers, that's a collective trauma. I mean, what's happening to pregnant women in Gaza or in Lebanon now, or Ukraine?
So there were quite a few questions, I think, that people wanted to ask, and I said ask you. Can anybody remember what their questions were?
I saw it mentioned Eben Alexander, don't you? I think
Dr. Evan Alexander, neurosurgeon, the Harvard-trained neurosurgeon, atheist who had a near-death experience.
Yes, well, I've met Alexander actually. Well, I think that's slightly not on the topic of epigenetics and morphic resonance, but it's very interesting that, when people undergo these conversion experiences, it's usually because of an experience, so something in his case. A lot of people who've had near-death experiences, in fact, see the world quite differently thereafter. Usually, the studies on people who've had them show that, on the whole, they become much less afraid of dying. They become much more interested in spiritual topics. That's certainly the case with Eben Alexander. And arguably, there are many people in the modern world whose opening to the spiritual realm happens through psychedelics. A lot of people who take psychedelics feel that they're in contact with a greater conscious reality, and it changes their worldview and their way of life. And a lot of people have spontaneous mystical experiences, without any drugs or anything which gives them the sense of connection with something greater than themselves. There's a whole range of spiritual practices and a whole range of mystical experiences. I discuss some of them in my book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. Yes.
There were some questions earlier, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, do you equate the knowing field with the morphogenetic field or morphic field?
You mean in family constellations?
Yeah, with your theory of morphic resonance.
Yes, I don't know. I think that there's clearly some kind of field phenomenon there, and there's clearly some kind of memory within it, and that representatives are able to tap into. And I would say that it's the only explanation I can think of, that it's what you'd expect with morphic resonance, or morphic resonance might explain part of it. It may not explain exactly how the representatives are able to tap into it, but unless there was something for them to tap into, it couldn't work. So I think morphic resonance can help explain that there's something to tap into, but exactly how and why the representatives are able to do so, and not only do so in person like you're doing here, but in Jill's online workshops as well. I mean, I was astonished that this worked online, and yet it does.
But it's so fascinating that somebody says, "You are my mother," and they instantly become that person. I mean, what is the trigger that turns them into that person, or instantly allows them to tune into the being they're tuned into.
I suppose just telling them they are that. I mean, I don't know quite how people instantly tune in, but they're told, and they then accept that suggestion. And
But there is some way in which the field can be allocated. You know, in this exercise where the birth order exercise, you know, the first corner, second corner, and so on. When people start moving around, for example, when there's nobody left in the first corner and somebody from the third corner, third and beyond, let's say, moves into the first corner, even though there's nobody there who was a firstborn, they feel what it's like to be a firstborn. So you can allocate the field. It's sort of like random. It's extraordinary.
yes.
How does that happen?
No, you tell me.
Because you say they feel.
Yeah.
They feel it, and I mean, what they get is information. It's sound. It's the light that they receive from the person standing in front of whatever.
No, but even if there's nobody there anymore, what I mean. So if I say that's the corner for the firstborn, and we start off with all the firstborn people going there, but if they've moved on and somebody from third and beyond goes and stands there, and I know this because I've done it.
Yeah.
They actually feel like a firstborn. So it's just you can allocate the field, and it becomes the field instantaneously.
But they know it's the corner of the firstborn.
They know it's the corner.
So they are informed by the word and the frequency firstborn, and anything else that they connect with it. So when they stand there, all the memory library and the feeling of what they connect with firstborn might be activated. And I say this because for a long time I did not realize that most of my information I get from feelings.
Maybe.
Just dropping in.
I mean, I have done the exercise and it absolutely works, but I would note that it's not, the field isn't instantaneous. Like you have to, like when we've done the exercise, it has to be established
Yes.
that this is the corner.
Exactly.
And then once the field is established by, I think you have, the different groups talk to each other from their personal experience
Yeah.
of being there in the birth order. So the field does have to be established in that area first.
Yes, but not for long. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, but you can also put blind representatives in that immediately feel into what it is. They have no idea what they are, but they sense it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
once it's established, absolutely.
Any idea, Rupert?
Well, you can arbitrarily establish fields. I mean, this happens in cricket matches and football matches.
Yeah.
When
Or
somebody says,
schoolhouses.
yes,
Yeah.
or when people are allocated to fielding in a particular position, for example, in
Yeah.
slips in cricket, you put someone there and they know what their role is in relation to everyone else in the team.
Yeah.
And the same in football. So this is, in a sense, happens all the time in sports, in team games. So it's just a very general principle.
Yes, my schoolhouse were always good at swimming. Anybody who went there was good at swimming.
Yeah, well, the fictional...
The sorting hat.
well, yes, exactly, as in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I will think out loud to formulate my question.
Please do.
So far, what I understood in the last few days is I think the morphic field is resourcing from the learned experiences of the past. Could it also gather resources, information from the future?
Well, I think morphic resonance works only from the past. That's a hypothesis. I mean, I think we are open to the future, but what morphic resonance is about memory and habit. And by definition, memory and habit are not what we're doing when we're thinking about the future. Well, I mean, in part they are, because we often repeat the same things. But the habits are, generally speaking, unconscious. And so a huge amount of our mental life is unconscious, as all sorts of people like Freud and Jung have pointed out. And as Jung pointed out, it's not just our unconscious, it's a collective unconscious. But our conscious minds are mainly concerned with choices among possible actions in the future. So I think our conscious minds are much more concerned with the future and with possibilities. And possibilities are things about the future. So I think in a sense our minds inhabit a kind of potential future. And the main function of consciousness, the way I see it, is to choose among possible courses of action. And so our conscious minds are very much concerned with future goals, future patterns, future expectations, future fears, etc. And we may also have glimpses of the future through precognitive dreams. Many people have precognitive dreams. They have a flash of something that's going to happen, usually in the next few days. So there is a way in which we are open to the future, but it's much less reliable and predictable than the way in which we're open to the past through memory. So I think there's a real asymmetry between the past and the future, and morphic resonance is about our relations with the past.
But how come we are able to tune in, even if not as reliably, into the future through our dreams or earthquakes, for example?
Well, no one knows, basically. I mean, there are theories, of course. I mean, some people say, well, it must be retrocausation in quantum theory. And so then sort of mainstream quantum theorists say nonsense. But no one knows. The thing is that what is clear from psychical research is that what you're picking up is not so much what's going to happen in the objective outer world. It's what you're picking up is something about your own experience in the future. It's something you experience. So you're tuning into your own mind in the future rather than the external world. That's usually the case with precognitive dreams. Now, how that would work with skilled clairvoyance, I don't know. Nobody knows. The number of people working in psychical research or parapsychology in the whole world is probably about 20, maybe 30. We have a discussion list. I'm the parapsychology discussion list, and I'm in almost daily contact with this whole community of researchers. I know them all personally and by name. There's, the number of universities where this goes on is infinitesimal. In Britain, it's basically Northampton. There's one or two people at Edinburgh, one or two people at Liverpool. But the vast majority of universities don't deal with it. The majority of schools, it's a taboo topic because it doesn't fit the materialist model of the mind being nothing but the brain. So the answer is nobody knows, but you can buy all sorts of books in occult bookshops where you will find theories about it, speculative theories. Which of them are right or wrong, I don't know.
I was going to ask, because you're talking about parapsychology, when we first moved to England in 1988, we bought a house, and I said to my husband, let's rip out the kitchen. I started speaking English, whereas we speak Dutch together, and he said, rip out the kitchen, there's nothing wrong with this kitchen. And to cut a long story short, it turned out we couldn't sell the house, whatever it was. But there was, in that house, there was a memory of what had happened. And somebody had indeed killed himself in that house. And I picked it up. I had a near-death experience very early in my life. So does that also fit into the theory of resonance?
I think so. I think when there's a memory in a place, you see, there can be memories in places, and most stories of hauntings are of some bad thing that's happened in the place where someone's died or been murdered or something in a place. And then there's kind of repetitive memory that people pick up, bad memories in the place. But there are also good memories in places, and many holy places, where people have had visionary experiences or unitive experiences, have a very powerful quality, which is also, I think, about the memory in the place. I don't think the memory is etched in the stones, because I don't think memory is physically, materially stored. I mean, I don't think it's even stored in our, as I said, I don't think it's even stored in our brains materially. I think it's a resonance across time from people in that place before, and we pick up that by morphic resonance. But the place has its own characteristics that tune us in to those memories by being in the same place. That's the way I think of it. Yeah.
Hey, I was listening to, I think it was Michael Levin talk about deer antlers, and he was talking about the idea of when, obviously deer antlers, I suppose, grow identical to each other on either side, but even when they get chopped off, they will grow again in the same form as
Yes.
before. But he described this phenomena of if you injure one of the deer antlers, it would grow this sort of bony, callous nub that actually would regrow on each subsequent shed. The injured nub would regrow in the same place on the antler.
Yes.
For about 5 generations after each shed. I suppose that really fits in with this idea of that sort
Of self-resonance.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you see, in general, self-resonance would be the most specific resonance, and I think it applies not only to memory, as I was describing earlier, but to form. So, and I think the reason we retain our more or less the same form over years, even though the chemicals in our bodies are constantly changing in many of the cells, is because of self-resonance in the realm of form. And Michael Levin, who some of you may have heard of, he's a biologist, a US biologist. He's my favorite biologist. He's very interested in memory phenomena. And so, as you said, with deer antler, if a deer develops an antler in an abnormal way because of an injury, they shed them every year and grow antlers afresh. In future years, they're grown with the same abnormality. It's somehow remembered, but it can't be remembered in the antler because the antler has been shed. And Michael Levin also did experiments where he trained flatworms, which are small worms that are flat, as the name implies, to learn something. They learned to respond to a light in a particular way. Then he chopped off their heads. What little brain they have is inside their head. And they regenerate very easily, so they regenerated a new head. And they could still remember what they'd learned. So Michael Levin, privately, I think he thinks this could be a morphic resonance phenomenon, which I think it must be a morphic resonance effect. Publicly, he says, well, maybe they're storing the memories all over the body in some unknown way.
Oh, right.
Because, you know, he's on the edge of morphic resonance, Michael Levin, but, you know, it's very heretical, and most scientists are worried about losing their jobs and their grants. And so although he's much more daring than most, there are limits to what he'll say in public.
Yeah.
But he's on the edge. He's probably the leading researcher in the world who's dancing on the edge of what's still permissible within materialistic biology, but which is pushing the frontiers.
Right, because he's doing sort of cancer morphology, isn't he? Or the idea of the cancer being a sort of separation of the field of the whole, and then forming a new field of whole, and then that self-proliferating. And
Yes, yes. He's very holistic and sees, you know, cancer and other diseases in a holistic way as well. Yeah.
Could I ask you, the way we develop from being first a single cell, which then divides and becomes an embryo, and that becomes a baby, and we become a human being, and the same for all other animals, so each cell, new cell, must decide whether it starts to become an eye or a nose or a fingernail. Can that be completely explained by genes and DNA? Or do you actually need something like a morphic field to explain the way it works?
Oh yes, no, it definitely can't be explained just by genes and DNA. I mean, people have been trying to do that for decades now. The aim of molecular biology has been to explain developmental biology just in terms of genes and proteins and other chemicals. And they failed over and over again. You have to have some top-down causation. I mean, where Michael Levin and I and many others agree is that there's a top-down organizing cause, like a field is a top-down cause. A magnetic field affects ion filings within it, and the whole field is what gives a pattern to it. The gravitational field of the Earth, keeps the Moon in orbit and it makes the Earth round. It's kind of top-down cause. Whereas molecular biology starts from a bottom-up explanation where you have genes that make proteins and then the proteins interact. The trouble is that once you've got, say, 100 different proteins, the number of ways in which they can interact is astronomical. You have what's called a combinatorial explosion. And you simply can't compute or predict the holistic patterns just on the basis of the molecules within it. You need a top-down causal system, which both Michael Levin and I call morphogenetic fields, a form-shaping field. And so to describe an embryo and its growth, the only really effective way of doing it within developmental biology is through morphogenetic fields. No one knows exactly what they are or how they work, but there must be some top-down causal system over and above the genes. The genes are activated or deactivated according to the field within which the cells are. And if you move cells from one field to another, they take on a new identity and do something different. And the attempt to explain morphogenetic fields in orthodox biology is almost entirely due to diffusion of chemicals and chemical gradients, but they simply can't explain the complexity of form. You need something over and above that.